A flight attendant yells at a young girl thinking she's just another passenger. But then, the shocking truth comes out. The girl's father doesn't just work for the airline, he owns it. What happens next will leave you speechless. Before we start the story, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you enjoy this story, don't forget to subscribe. The plane had just taken off, and the passengers were settling in for the long flight. Among them was a young girl, no older than 12, sitting by the window, nervously fidgeting with her seatbelt. Her father sat beside her, looking out the window, his mind elsewhere. She struggled to lift her small carry-on into the overhead compartment, trying to reach the bin, but it was too high. A flight attendant passing by noticed the girl's difficulty and immediately approached. "Come on, hurry up. You're blocking the aisle," the flight attendant said, her voice sharp. She stared down at the girl who was still trying to push her bag into the bin. The girl froze, looking up at the attendant, her hands trembling slightly as she tried again. The attendant, clearly annoyed, sighed loudly and said, "What's so hard about putting your bag up there? You're causing a scene." The girl's face turned red. She didn't say anything back but kept trying to lift the bag. Her father, noticing the tension, turned towards the flight attendant. He wasn't happy, but he kept his voice calm as he spoke. "Is there a problem?" he asked, his tone measured. The attendant barely glanced at him, rolling her eyes before responding. "She's holding up the aisle. People need to get through." Without waiting for another word, she turned and walked away, muttering under her breath. The girl looked down, not wanting to make a bigger issue out of it. Her father, though, could tell she was upset. After a few minutes, the father leaned in and whispered to his daughter, "Don't worry, everything's fine." He tried to reassure her with a smile, but she wasn't convinced. The flight attendant had made her feel small, and it was hard to shake that feeling. The rest of the passengers were distracted, reading, watching movies, or talking. No one else seemed to notice what had just happened. The father, however, kept his eye on the flight attendant, not sure if he was going to let this go. He decided it wasn't worth making a scene, for now. But something inside him knew it wasn't right. The girl, still quiet, stared out the window, trying to ignore the sting of the words she had just heard. What the flight attendant didn't know, and what the girl didn't realize either, was that this wasn't just any random passenger. This was a moment that would soon change everything. But it wasn't until much later that the full story would unfold. As the plane cruised through the sky, the flight attendant went about her duties, checking on passengers and delivering drinks. She didn't give the young girl another thought. After all, she was just another child, one of many she had dealt with over the years. The father, still quiet, pulled out his phone to check a few emails. He didn't seem bothered anymore, but the tension between him and the flight attendant still lingered in the air. The girl, feeling a mix of embarrassment and anger, kept her eyes glued to the window, wishing the whole situation had never happened. She could feel the weight of the flight attendant's harsh words pressing down on her, even though she tried to ignore it. As the flight went on, the discomfort stayed with her. She wished her father would say something, but he remained silent as though he was holding back something important. A few hours into the flight, the father received a text. He read it quickly, his expression shifting slightly. It wasn't anything alarming, but it seemed to change his mood. He briefly glanced over at the flight attendant as she made her way down the aisle, offering drinks to passengers. His gaze was steady, and for a moment, the flight attendant caught his eyes. Something about the way he looked at her made her feel uneasy. She didn't think much of it, though. After all, it was just a fleeting glance, nothing unusual. At that moment, the father stood up and walked toward the galley, his phone still in his hand. The girl, now feeling a little more at ease, took a deep breath, trying to shake off the feeling that had been building up inside her. She watched her father as he disappeared into the back of the plane, wondering what had been so important in that message. She didn't know it yet, but in just a few minutes everything was about to change. The flight attendant, meanwhile, continued serving drinks, unaware of the growing tension just behind her. She passed by the girl again, but this time she didn't say anything. The girl stayed in her seat, her thoughts racing. What was going to happen next? Would her father say something? Would this awkward moment just fade away, or would it blow up into something bigger? She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Minutes later, the father returned to his seat, looking calm as ever, though the flight attendant still noticed a slight change in his demeanor. She couldn't put her finger on it, but something was different. He didn't speak to the girl, but simply sat down beside her, still holding his phone. Then, with a casual glance at the flight attendant, he spoke, his tone almost casual. But there was an underlying seriousness in his words. "I own this airline," he said, as if it was the most ordinary thing in the world. The flight attendant blinked, her mind registering the words but not fully understanding them at first. "What?" she asked, half laughing, unsure if she had heard him correctly. It didn't make sense. "You own this airline?" He nodded, still looking calm, as if the statement meant nothing. He didn't seem in a hurry to explain, but instead handed her his business card. The card was simple, but it held a truth that the flight attendant wasn't prepared for. She took it from him, her fingers slightly trembling as she glanced at the name printed on the card. CEO, Airline Corporation. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Her mind raced, trying to process the information. This was no ordinary passenger. The flight attendant's face flushed. Her eyes darted from the business card to the father, then back again. The realization hit her hard. She had just yelled at the child of the man who owned the very airline she worked for. Her stomach dropped. She couldn't believe it. How had she not known? She looked around nervously, hoping no one else had overheard the exchange. The hum of the plane's engine seemed louder now, a stark contrast to the quiet panic rising in her chest. She tried to keep her composure, but her voice faltered when she spoke. I didn't know. I'm so sorry," she stammered, her words tumbling out too quickly. The father didn't respond immediately, but the girl, still sitting quietly beside him, noticed the sudden shift in the flight attendant's tone. The attendant stood there for a few seconds, awkwardly shifting her weight from one foot to the other. She knew she had made a mistake, but apologizing didn't feel like enough. The father's eyes were still on her, but he didn't seem angry, at least not in the way she expected. He was calm, almost too calm, and it made her nervous. She had expected some kind of outburst, maybe a demand for compensation or an official complaint, but instead he just stared at her, silent. "Look," he said finally, his voice low and steady. "This kind of behavior doesn't fly with me. Not for my daughter, not for anyone." His eyes were cold now, and the flight attendant could see the seriousness in them. She had crossed a line, and she knew it. She had misjudged him, and now she had to face the consequences. I understand," she replied, her voice shaky. "I'm really sorry. I didn't mean to." He cut her off before she could finish. "You've already said your piece. I don't need any more apologies." He sat back in his seat, turning his attention back to his phone as if the conversation was already over. The flight attendant stood there for a moment, unsure of what to do. She opened her mouth to speak again, but closed it when she saw the girl's eyes on her. The child hadn't said a word since the initial confrontation, but there was a silent anger in her gaze that was hard to ignore. The flight attendant quickly turned away, feeling the weight of her mistake pressing down on her. She walked back down the aisle, her mind racing. How had she let this happen? She was usually so careful. She had seen plenty of children on flights, some misbehaving, others shy and quiet, but she had never treated anyone like this. But something about the girl's bag, the way she was struggling with it, had set her off. Maybe it was the stress of the job, the long hours, the repetitive tasks. She didn't know. All she knew was that she had crossed a line, and now she couldn't undo it. As the flight continued, the atmosphere felt different. The tension hung in the air, heavy and uncomfortable. The father didn't say anything more, and the girl, still upset, seemed lost in thought. The flight attendant went back to her duties, but she kept her distance from them, unsure of how to fix what she had broken. She didn't know what the father would do next, whether he would report her, ask for a formal apology, or let it go. But she had a sinking feeling that this wasn't going to be something she could just forget about. As the hours passed, The flight attendant did her best to avoid any further interactions with the father and his daughter. She focused on her tasks, trying to keep her mind off the awkward moment that had just passed. But the unease didn't go away. It lingered, and every time she passed by their seats, she could feel the father's eyes on her, watching, waiting. She tried to shake it off, but there was a tension now, a constant reminder of the mistake she had made. About halfway through the flight, she found herself walking down the aisle again, offering drinks to the passengers. She tried to keep her composure, smile professionally, and keep moving. But when she reached the father's row, she hesitated for a brief moment. The girl was still sitting by the window, staring out, her head resting against the seat. The father, however, was watching her closely. His expression was unreadable, but there was something in the way he held himself that made her nervous. She wasn't sure if he was still angry, or if he had already made up his mind about what to do. The flight attendant stopped beside them, still not sure what to say. She had offered her apology already, but it hadn't felt genuine enough. The words had rushed out of her mouth, and now she regretted it. She opened her mouth to speak again, but before she could, the father looked up at her, his eyes cold and steady. "I don't think you understand what you've done," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You didn't just treat my daughter badly. You disrespected me too, and that's something I don't take lightly." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She had thought maybe it would blow over, that he would forget about it, but clearly she was wrong. She stood there, unsure of how to respond. What could she say? She had already apologized, but the damage was done. The father didn't wait for her to reply. Instead, he continued, his tone still calm but filled with authority. "I own this airline, and what you've done today, how you treated my daughter, that's not how I run things around here. People should be treated with respect, no matter who they are." The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just about a simple mistake anymore. She had crossed a line with the wrong person, and now she was paying the price. She felt her throat tighten as the weight of his words settled in. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. She had no excuse for what she had done. She knew that now. The apology she had given earlier hadn't been enough to fix it. Nothing could undo the sting of her actions, especially now that she knew who the father was. "I understand," she finally managed to say, her voice small. "I truly am sorry. I didn't mean to disrespect you or your daughter." The father nodded slowly but didn't say anything more. He just looked at her for a moment longer before turning his attention back to the window. The flight attendant stood there, feeling the weight of the silence hanging between them. It was clear that there was nothing more she could say. Her attempt at reconciliation had fallen flat, and the damage was done. The father had made it clear respect was not optional. It was expected. She walked away, trying to shake off the feeling of humiliation that was starting to settle in. The rest of the flight was a blur. She went through the motions, serving passengers, checking on them. But her mind was elsewhere, stuck on the conversation she had just had. She couldn't stop thinking about how she had misjudged him, how she had assumed he was just another passenger to boss around. And now she was paying the price for that mistake. As the flight began its descent, the flight attendant couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would the father file a formal complaint? Would she lose her job over this? She didn't know. But one thing was certain. This would be a story she would never forget. The plane began its descent, and the flight attendant's nerves were frayed. She tried to keep busy, checking seatbelts and making sure everything was in order, but her thoughts kept drifting back to the conversation. The father's calm demeanor had unsettled her. He had not shouted, not demanded anything in that moment. But the finality in his words, his quiet authority, made it clear that he didn't need to raise his voice to command respect. She had crossed a line, and no amount of apologies could fix it now. Meanwhile, the father and daughter sat quietly, the girl still looking out of the window. She had said nothing since the exchange. Her father hadn't spoken to her much either, but he had a way of communicating with his presence. a calm that settled over her like a shield. She could tell he wasn't angry, but there was a quiet intensity about him now, a sharpness that she hadn't noticed before. She didn't fully understand what had just happened, but she knew it wasn't something she'd forget soon. As the plane touched down, the flight attendant stood at the front, her eyes scanning the cabin one last time. She caught a glimpse of the father, still seated, still with that calm, unreadable expression. The moment was almost over, but the sting of what had happened remained. She had to face whatever consequences were waiting for her, but part of her hoped that maybe, just maybe, it would all blow over. Maybe no one would know what happened. Maybe the father would move on and forget about the incident. But that hope quickly shattered as the plane taxied to the gate, and the announcement to deplane was made. The father stood up first, gathering his things. The girl followed, her bag now securely stowed in the overhead compartment. As the aisle slowly emptied, the flight attendant watched them, her stomach tightening. She knew she had to face him one last time. This wasn't over yet. When the father reached the front, he stopped in front of the flight attendant, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The noise of passengers filing past them seemed distant, as if they were in a bubble of their own. The flight attendant swallowed hard, waiting for him to say something, to finally express the full extent of his anger. But instead, he simply handed her his business card again, this time with a firm but calm gesture. "Make sure this gets to someone who matters," he said, his voice cool. "I think it's time for a real apology." The flight attendant's heart skipped a beat as she looked down at the card. She recognized the name printed on it. His title as CEO was now a harsh reminder of her mistake. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say. Without another word, the father turned and walked away, his daughter trailing behind him. The flight attendant stood frozen for a moment, her hands trembling slightly. She knew this wasn't just about a simple apology anymore. This was a warning, a reminder that her actions had consequences far beyond what she had imagined. As she watched them disappear into the crowd of passengers, the weight of the situation finally settled in. She had made a mistake, and now it was clear that she would have to face the fallout from it. This wasn't just a minor inconvenience. It was something that could change the course of her career. The flight attendant let out a slow breath, trying to compose herself. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but one thing was certain. Things would never be the same again. The final passengers trickled off the plane, each one oblivious to the drama that had just unfolded in the air. The flight attendant stood at the front, her uniform feeling heavier than ever. Her hands gripped the armrest of the door, but she couldn't bring herself to move. She wanted to escape, to run from the reality of what had just happened, but she knew she couldn't. Her mind raced as she replayed the exchange in her head. The father's calmness was still unsettling. She had expected some kind of confrontation, a scene that would give her the chance to explain herself, to make it right. But instead, he had been so collected, so measured in his words. The business card, the quiet authority. It was as if he had already made up his mind about what needed to be done. And now, with the card back in her hand, she knew that this wasn't going to end here. This was going to follow her. The flight attendant took a deep breath and walked down the aisle to the galley. The final crew members were finishing up their duties, gathering their things, preparing to leave. The head flight attendant, noticing her pale face, gave her a look of concern. "Everything okay?" she asked, her voice kind but sharp, like a person who could tell something was wrong without needing an explanation. The flight attendant nodded but couldn't meet her eyes. She just mumbled, "Yeah, I'm fine." She forced a weak smile, but it was clear that something was off. But the head flight attendant didn't press the issue. She was busy with her own tasks, making sure everything was in order for their arrival at the gate. So the flight attendant was left alone with her thoughts, standing in the corner of the galley. Her hands were shaking now, the business card still clutched tightly in her fingers. She glanced down at it again, the name staring back at her. The CEO of the airline, the same airline that had employed her for the past several years. She had just yelled at his daughter. Her mind kept returning to the same question. How had she not known? The answer seemed so simple now. She had been too quick to judge. The girl struggling with the overhead bin had seemed like just another annoying child who wasn't paying attention to the simple rules of the flight. But in that moment, the flight attendant hadn't bothered to stop and think. She hadn't taken a second to assess the situation, to see the girl's nervousness, her hesitation. She had simply assumed the worst, and that assumption now had cost her. The minutes felt like hours as the flight attendant continued to stand in the galley, lost in her thoughts. She knew that soon the captain would give the go-ahead to disembark, and she would have to walk off the plane, face the real world again, and deal with the consequences of her actions. She couldn't hide from this. It was already out in the open. Finally, the call came over the intercom, signaling the end of the flight. The passengers had all left, and it was time for the crew to head out. The flight attendant grabbed her bag, trying to compose herself as she headed toward the exit. She glanced down at the business card one more time, feeling a knot form in her stomach. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. As she stepped off the plane, her heart raced. She walked through the airport, not daring to look around, but every part of her was alert. The father and daughter were long gone, their footsteps fading into the crowd, but the weight of the encounter hung over her. She passed the gate agents, the other flight attendants, the pilots, all of them oblivious to what had just happened. But then, as she walked toward the crew room, she saw the manager standing near the entrance, talking to a few other staff members. He caught sight of her and waved her over. She forced a smile, but her stomach tightened. She knew what was coming. "Hey, you okay?" he asked, his tone a little too casual. He hadn't heard the story yet, but there was something in his eyes, a certain unease, that made her wonder if he had already gotten a hint of what had happened. She didn't answer right away. She just nodded, too tired to explain. But he could see that something was wrong. "Listen," he said. "There's been a complaint. A passenger." He paused, glancing at the paper in his hand. "Well, let's just say it's a big one. You're gonna need to go to HR." The blood drained from her face. A complaint? She had a feeling she knew exactly who had filed it. She forced herself to stay calm, to keep her voice steady. "Who filed it?" she asked quietly, though she already knew the answer. He glanced at the paper again and then back at her, a little more serious now. "The CEO of the airline. Apparently you were rude to his daughter." She couldn't breathe. She could feel the walls closing in, the pressure mounting. "It's over," she thought. "This is it." The manager gave her a sympathetic look. "Listen, I'm sure it wasn't intentional, but you're going to need to explain your side to HR. They'll be the ones to decide what happens next." She nodded numbly, unable to speak. As she walked toward the HR office, the business card still gripped tightly in her hand, she couldn't shake the feeling that her world had just been turned upside down. Her career, her reputation, it all hung in the balance now, and there was nothing she could do to change it. The reality of her mistake hit her like a ton of bricks. She had thought this was just a simple error in judgment, but now it felt like the beginning of something much worse. As the flight attendant made her way to the HR office, each step felt heavier than the last. Her heart was pounding, her palms sweating, but she couldn't turn back now. The business card in her hand was a constant reminder of the mess she'd created. Her mind was spinning. How could I have been so careless, she kept asking herself. She had worked at the airline for years, had always prided herself on being professional, polite, and attentive to the passengers. But now, it felt like all of that was slipping away, reduced to a single moment of poor judgment. When she reached the HR office, she paused outside the door. She could hear muffled voices inside, a conversation she couldn't quite make out. She took a deep breath and knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," a voice called from inside. She pushed the door open and stepped inside, trying to steady her nerves. The HR manager, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, looked up from her desk, where she had been speaking with another staff member. She smiled faintly, but there was a seriousness to her expression that made the flight attendant's stomach knot up even further. "Have a seat," the HR manager said, motioning to the chair across from her. "I'm glad you could come in quickly. This shouldn't take too long." The flight attendant sat down, but the chair felt like it was swallowing her whole. She glanced at the paperwork on the desk, but it didn't matter. Her focus was on the situation, on the complaint she knew was about to be discussed. "Now," the HR manager began, "we've received a formal complaint from a passenger on today's flight. A very important passenger, I might add. Apparently, there was an issue between you and his daughter." The flight attendant's face burned. The words felt like they were stabbing into her. She nodded, her voice barely a whisper. "I know who it is," she said, her throat dry. "I know what happened." The HR manager raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "You do? Well, why don't you tell me your side of the story first and we'll go from there?" The flight attendant took a deep breath. She could feel her heart racing, her pulse pounding in her ears. I made a mistake," she said slowly. When I saw the girl struggling with her bag, I got frustrated. She was taking too long, and I was just trying to get the aisle cleared. I didn't think about it. I was rude and I shouldn't have been. And then when her father asked if there was a problem, I was short with him too. I didn't know who he was. I didn't know he was the owner of the airline. She stopped there, her voice trailing off. She felt sick to her stomach. She hadn't wanted to make excuses, but it seemed like she was grasping at straws, trying to explain how things had gone so wrong. The HR manager was silent for a moment, staring at her as if she were weighing her words. "I understand," the HR manager finally said, her tone softer now. "But I need to ask you to be more specific. What exactly did you say to the girl? What did you say to her father?" The flight attendant hesitated. I told the girl to hurry up. I told her she was blocking the aisle and that she needed to stop making a scene. And when her father asked if there was a problem, I said, "She's holding up the aisle, people need to get through." The HR manager scribbled some notes on the paper in front of her. "And when he said that he owned the airline?" she asked, looking up with a curious expression. The flight attendant's face burned even hotter. "I didn't believe him at first. I thought it was a joke. But then he gave me his business card. I didn't know what to say. I tried to apologize, but I don't think it was enough. I feel like it was too late at that point." The HR manager leaned back in her chair, taking in what the flight attendant had said. "I see," she murmured. She paused for a moment, as if considering something. "The father has made it clear that he wants a formal apology, and that's something we'll have to arrange. But he also mentioned that he felt disrespected, not just for himself, but for his daughter. And it's clear from your statement that you understand why he feels that way." The flight attendant nodded, her throat tight. "I do. I really do. I didn't mean to disrespect him or his daughter. It was a poor choice of words, and I didn't stop to think about how it might come across." The HR manager set her pen down and looked at her with a serious expression. "You need to understand something. In customer service, we don't get to decide who's important or who's not. Everyone should be treated with respect, whether they're a CEO or just a regular passenger. That's something we take very seriously here." The flight attendant nodded again, her eyes downcast. She knew the rules. She knew she had violated them. It wasn't just about the father being the owner of the airline. It was about how she had made the girl feel small, insignificant, unimportant. The father may have been the CEO, but to his daughter he was just her father, and she had disrespected both of them. "I understand," she said quietly. The HR manager sighed, her tone softening a bit. "Look, we all make mistakes. It's how we learn from them that counts. And I can see that you regret your actions. But there will be consequences for what happened today. We'll need you to write a formal apology to the family, and we'll also need to report this to the higher-ups. I can't say what they'll decide, but this isn't something that will be overlooked." The flight attendant felt her chest tighten. She hadn't been expecting a free pass, but hearing the weight of the consequences coming down on her made it feel all the more real. She had thought she might just get a warning or a talking to, but now it was clear. This was serious. She had stepped out of line in a big way, and she was going to have to face the fallout. "I understand," she repeated, her voice small. The HR manager smiled faintly, as if trying to reassure her. "We all have our moments," she said. "What matters now is how you handle it. You can learn from this and you'll move forward." The flight attendant nodded again, though she wasn't sure if she believed that just yet. She felt like she was walking through a fog, unsure of what was going to happen next. But one thing was certain. This was the beginning of a long road to make things right, and it wouldn't be easy. After the meeting with HR, the flight attendant walked out of the office with a heavy heart. Her thoughts were a blur, the weight of the conversation still pressing down on her shoulders. She had hoped that the situation might blow over, that the CEO might simply move on and forget about the incident. But the reality was much harsher than that. A formal complaint had been lodged, and she had already been told the steps that would follow. A written apology to the family, a possible review by upper management, and a black mark on her record that could affect her future with the airline. She took the long walk back to the crew room, her mind racing. What have I done? She couldn't help but ask herself again. Her earlier frustration had clouded her judgment, and now she had to face the consequences of her actions. It wasn't just about yelling at a passenger. It was about the way she had treated someone with power, someone who could easily make her life much harder. The reality of that truth made her stomach churn. Her colleagues were still hanging around the crew room, chatting and unwinding after the flight, but no one said anything to her. They didn't know the full story yet. She could already feel the weight of the situation in the air, as if the room itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The flight attendant sat down on one of the chairs, staring at the floor. The business card was still in her hand, now folded in half, and she couldn't stop staring at it. "I could have just been nicer. I could have just thought before I spoke." But that didn't help her now. The damage had been done. It wasn't long before the captain came into the room, looking for her. He was a no-nonsense kind of guy, always efficient and straightforward. When he saw her, he didn't greet her like he usually did. Instead, his eyes studied her for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Hey," he said, his voice flat. "I heard about what happened. You okay?" The flight attendant looked up at him, her face flushed with embarrassment. "Not really," she admitted. "I messed up. I didn't think before I spoke, and now I've got a complaint. I don't know what's going to happen." The captain nodded, taking a seat across from her. He didn't say anything at first, letting the silence hang between them. It wasn't uncomfortable, though. He seemed to be weighing her words, trying to figure out what to say next. Finally, he spoke up, his tone much softer than usual. "Look," he began, "I know this job isn't easy. We all have our days where we get frustrated, and things don't go the way we want them to. But you've got to remember that you're not just dealing with passengers. You're dealing with people who might not show you who they are right away, and you can't afford to make assumptions. Not like that." The flight attendant nodded, her throat tight. She had heard the advice 100 times before. Treat everyone with respect. Don't judge a book by its cover. But hearing it now, after everything that had happened, it hit harder. The reality of what she had done was sinking in, and it wasn't pretty. She had assumed the worst about the young girl, and, by extension, about her father. That assumption had cost her. "I know," she said quietly. "I screwed up. I was short with the girl and with her dad, and I didn't realize who I was dealing with. I just reacted without thinking." The captain studied her for a moment longer, then nodded again. "It happens, but what you need to understand is that it's not just about you. It's about the image of the airline, too. When someone at that level, someone important, feels disrespected, it reflects badly on all of us. You might have thought you were just doing your job, but there's more at play here. It's a bigger picture than that." The flight attendant's hands were trembling now. "I get it," she whispered. "I really do. And I'm sorry. I'll do whatever I can to make this right." The captain gave her a long, hard look, and then he exhaled slowly, as if releasing some of the tension in the room. "You're not going to lose your job over this, not unless something goes terribly wrong. But this is a lesson. You've learned it the hard way, but we all have our moments. The important thing is how you handle the aftermath. Take responsibility, own up to your mistake, and make sure it doesn't happen again. People will respect that." She nodded, the words sinking in. The captain wasn't sugarcoating things, but he wasn't condemning her either. He was trying to make her see the bigger picture, the way her actions could ripple out and affect others. She could feel the weight of it now. This wasn't just about her. It was about the airline, about the passengers, and about the way she represented the company as a whole. The room fell silent again, and the captain stood up. "You've got this," he said, his voice a little warmer now. "Just stay professional, write the apology, and let's see how it plays out. And remember, it's a job. It's not your whole life. You can bounce back from this." The flight attendant watched him walk out of the room, her mind still spinning. She didn't know if she could bounce back from this. She didn't know what was coming next, but she had a feeling that the next few days would be crucial. She needed to prove to herself, and to everyone else, that she could handle the fallout and learn from this. She couldn't afford to make the same mistake again. But deep down, she knew that it wasn't just about proving herself to others. It was about making things right with the girl, with her father, and with the airline. It wasn't going to be easy. She had a long road ahead of her, and she wasn't sure how it would end. But one thing was certain. The story wasn't over yet. The rest of the day dragged on in a haze. The flight attendant had returned to her apartment after the conversation with the captain, but her mind refused to shut off. The walls felt like they were closing in as she sat alone, the weight of the complaint pressing on her chest. She hadn't expected it to be easy, but now, with everything laid out before her, she realized just how much was at stake. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was late, but she couldn't sleep. Her phone was sitting on the kitchen counter, the business card from the CEO still resting beside it. She had been staring at it for what felt like hours, wondering if she should try to call him, perhaps apologize directly, though she knew it would probably make things worse. She had already apologized once, and that hadn't been enough. Her mind kept replaying the incident on the plane, the girl's nervousness, the flight attendant's impatience. How, in that moment, it had all seemed so insignificant, a minor interaction that would pass. But now, it felt like everything had spiraled out of control because of a single snap judgment. She had let frustration cloud her professionalism, and that moment of weakness had led to something much bigger than she could have imagined. She stood up, walked over to the kitchen counter, and grabbed her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen, but she hesitated. She thought about the formal apology she had been asked to write. It wasn't just about the girl. It wasn't even just about the father. It was about taking responsibility for how she had behaved. But how do you apologize for something like this? How do you fix what felt like a broken moment in time? After a few minutes, she started typing. Her first draft was rough, filled with fragmented thoughts and uneasy sentences. It was hard to find the right words to make things right. "Dear Mr. Thompson, I am writing this letter to offer my sincerest apologies for my actions during your flight earlier today. I deeply regret the way I treated your daughter, and I realize now that I was wrong to speak to her in the manner that I did. It was completely inappropriate, and I can only imagine how uncomfortable I made her feel. I also want to apologize for my response to you. I should have treated you with the same respect I would offer to any other passenger, regardless of who you are. My behavior was unprofessional, and I understand the impact it may have had on you and your family. Please know that this is not how I typically conduct myself, and I am truly sorry for my actions. I take full responsibility for my behavior, and I want to assure you that this will never happen again. I am committed to learning from this mistake and becoming a better representative of the airline I work for. Once again, I apologize for my actions and any distress they may have caused. I hope we can move past this, and I hope you will accept my heartfelt apology. Sincerely, Emily Walker." She stared at the screen for a moment. Was it enough? She wondered. Would it be enough? The apology felt real, but would the CEO see it the same way? Would he even read it? Or would it just be another note lost in the shuffle? The doubt was overwhelming, and she couldn't shake the feeling that this apology would never be enough to undo the damage she had caused. She pressed send. The next few days felt like a blur. The flight attendant went through the motions of her work, but her mind was never fully present. She worked the early shifts, always with a sense of dread hanging over her. Every time she interacted with a passenger, she couldn't help but wonder if they were secretly judging her. Do they know? She would think. Can they tell I've messed up? She hadn't heard anything back from the CEO, but that didn't stop the anxiety from eating away at her. She tried to keep up with her usual duties, serving drinks, helping with luggage, making small talk with passengers, but all of it felt like a performance. The joy of the job had faded, replaced with an overwhelming pressure to be perfect, to do everything right, knowing that her next mistake could be her last. On the fourth day after sending the apology, she was called into HR again. She was told to come by in the afternoon, and the timing made her stomach drop. This is it, she thought. This is where it all comes crashing down. She walked into the HR office with a sense of resignation. The same HR manager, Sarah, greeted her with a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. She motioned for Emily to sit down. "How have you been doing?" Sarah asked, her tone neutral but friendly enough. Emily nodded stiffly, unsure how to respond. "Okay, I guess. Still trying to make it right," she said, her voice quiet. She hadn't expected any sort of relief yet. She knew the apology was just the first step, but the dread of the unknown was eating at her. Sarah nodded. "Good to hear. Look, Mr. Thompson received your apology and he's reviewed the situation. I'm going to be honest with you. He was upset. But after some consideration, he decided to let it go." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She wasn't sure she had heard her right. "Let it go?" she repeated, almost incredulously. "Yes," Sarah replied, giving her a reassuring smile. "He's decided not to pursue any further action. He did want to make sure that you understand the seriousness of the situation, though. This isn't something he takes lightly, and neither do we. But he's accepted your apology, and he's willing to move forward from it." Emily let out a shaky breath, her chest loosening. The weight that had been pressing on her for days seemed to lift, though the relief was tinged with guilt. She still couldn't believe it. After everything, after her mistake, she was getting a second chance. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know what to say." "You don't need to say anything," Sarah replied kindly. "Just keep it in mind going forward. This could have gone much differently, but you took responsibility for your actions, and that counts for something." Emily nodded, trying to process it all. She had been given a second chance, and she couldn't waste it. As she left the office, her mind was finally starting to clear. The dread was gone, replaced by a quiet determination. She still had work to do, on herself, on her attitude, on her professionalism, but she knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let this moment define her. She would learn, she would grow, and she would be better because of it. It wasn't over yet, but she was on the path to making it right. The weight of the past week was starting to feel like a distant memory, but the lessons from it remained fresh in Emily's mind. The relief she had felt after hearing from HR that Mr. Thompson had decided to let the matter go was tempered by a deep awareness of how close she had come to losing everything. Every day since, she had been focused on doing her job with the utmost care and professionalism, always mindful of the reputation she represented, not just the airline, but herself. The next few flights felt different. She wasn't sure if it was the nervous energy that still lingered, or if it was just the pressure she put on herself to prove that she could do better. But Emily found herself more aware than ever of the interactions she had with passengers. She smiled more genuinely, was more patient, and tried to be as helpful as possible, all the while keeping a careful eye on her words. The small, seemingly inconsequential moments that used to slip by without a second thought now felt loaded. A slight smile to a passenger struggling with a suitcase, The simple act of making sure a nervous traveler had everything they needed to feel comfortable. These were the things that mattered now. Emily knew that every decision she made, no matter how small, was part of the process of rebuilding the trust she had almost lost. There were times when she caught herself slipping back into old habits. Impatience when people didn't follow instructions right away. Irritation when a passenger was taking too long to find their seat. But now, she was quick to recognize those moments and check herself. The incident on the plane with Mr. Thompson's daughter was a constant reminder in the back of her mind, forcing her to slow down and take a breath before reacting. The girl's wide, confused eyes when she had yelled at her, the stunned silence of her father. Those images stayed with her, lingering like a shadow. The first few shifts back felt oddly quiet, almost as if her colleagues were waiting for something to happen. The flight attendant's usual interactions were muted, as though everyone was uncertain about how to approach her after everything that had transpired. But Emily wasn't sure what to expect either. She didn't need anyone to treat her differently, but she could sense the shift. Some crew members avoided eye contact. Others gave her sympathetic looks. She tried not to dwell on it. Her focus was on rebuilding her professionalism step by step. It wasn't until the end of the week that she felt like she was starting to find a rhythm again. She had worked 3 back-to-back shifts, keeping busy, staying focused, and putting the incident behind her. That was when she received a call from HR. Emily's stomach flipped when she saw the number on her phone. She took a deep breath before answering. "Hello, Emily. It's Sarah again from HR. I hope you're doing well." Sarah's voice sounded pleasant, but there was something formal about it, like she was about to deliver news. "Hi, Sarah," Emily said, her heart racing. "Is everything okay?" "Actually, yes," Sarah said, and Emily let out a small breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "I just wanted to let you know that Mr. Thompson did indeed read your apology, and he appreciated the gesture. But I also want to inform you that we've decided to implement a few changes going forward." Emily's heart sank again, but she forced herself to listen. "We've spoken with the management team," Sarah continued, "and while you've been given a second chance, there will be some additional training and a review of your conduct over the next few months. It's not a punishment, but more of a reminder about how important it is to maintain professionalism at all times. The company wants to make sure this doesn't happen again, and it's part of a broader program to reinforce customer service standards across the board." Emily felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. It wasn't a dismissal, which was the most important thing, but the idea of extra scrutiny weighed on her. "That makes sense," she said, trying to sound calm. "I understand completely. I'll do whatever it takes." "Good," Sarah replied. "You've shown that you're willing to own up to your mistake, and that's a good first step. Just keep up the good work and you'll be fine." Emily nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "Thank you, Sarah. I really appreciate the opportunity." "Of course," Sarah said. "We'll check in again soon. Take care." When she hung up the phone, Emily leaned back in her chair, her mind racing. The relief that had washed over her when she heard that she wasn't being fired slowly faded as she processed what Sarah had said. The company was watching her, and she knew she couldn't afford another mistake. Not now. But it wasn't just about the airline anymore. It wasn't even about Mr. Thompson's forgiveness. The real change had to come from within. She had to prove, not just to them, but to herself, that she could rise above the incident and emerge stronger. This was a test of her character, not just her job performance. For the first time in days, Emily allowed herself a small smile. It wasn't the smile of someone who had gotten away with something. It was the smile of someone who had learned a hard lesson, someone who had faced the consequences of their actions and was now determined to do better. The next few shifts were easier. Her colleagues began to treat her like normal again, the awkwardness starting to fade. She didn't feel the weight of their eyes on her anymore. In fact, the crew seemed to rally behind her in subtle ways, offering support when needed, joking around during breaks, helping to lift the tension that had surrounded her for the past week. Still, Emily knew that it wasn't enough to just be good at her job. She had to be exceptional, and she had to stay that way. The pressure of knowing that she was still under review from the higher-ups kept her sharp, and she made sure to keep a level head no matter what happened. If she slipped up, it could mean more than just a reprimand. It could mean the end of her career with the airline. But something had shifted inside her. She had learned that humility, respect, and professionalism were not just words to be spoken when it was convenient. They were actions to be taken every single day, even when the pressure was high, even when the passengers were rude, or the workload felt overwhelming. As the weeks went on, Emily started to feel like herself again. The shadow of that single moment of bad judgment never fully disappeared, but it became less heavy with each passing day. She found herself back in the flow of the job, serving passengers with the same attention to detail she had always strived for, but now with a deeper sense of purpose. She knew that this job, this airline, wasn't just about serving drinks or answering questions. It was about being a part of something bigger, about representing more than just herself. And that was a responsibility she would carry with her every day for the rest of her career. A few months had passed since the incident, and Emily had slowly begun to feel like herself again. The weeks of extra training, the constant reminder of her actions, and the careful attention to every detail of her job had all become part of her daily routine. She still thought about that moment, the look in the girl's eyes when she had yelled at her, the silence of her father, the sting of the apology she had given afterward. But it wasn't something that controlled her anymore. She had come to realize that while the consequences had been harsh, they were necessary. They were a reminder of what she needed to do to grow, to become better, and more importantly, to hold herself accountable. She hadn't been perfect, but she had learned, and that, in the end, was what mattered most. One evening, as Emily was finishing up a flight and preparing to disembark, something unexpected happened. She had just walked into the terminal, her bag slung over her shoulder, when she saw a familiar face, Mr. Thompson, the CEO. At first, she froze. Her heart skipped a beat, her throat tightening as she tried to quickly assess the situation. There he was, standing near the luggage carousel, talking to a few other passengers. He hadn't noticed her yet, but she recognized the same calm demeanor he had displayed the day of the incident. The urge to walk the other way was almost overwhelming, but something stopped her. She couldn't avoid him, not now, not after everything that had happened. She had learned how to face her mistakes head on, and this was no different. Taking a deep breath, Emily straightened her back and walked towards him. As she got closer, he glanced up and caught her eye. For a brief moment, he didn't seem to recognize her, but then his eyes sharpened, and the memory of that day seemed to flicker in his mind. "Ms. Walker," he said, his tone neutral but not unkind. "I see you're still with the company." "Yes, Mr. Thompson," Emily replied, trying to keep her voice steady. "I've learned a lot since that day. I just wanted to thank you again for your understanding." He studied her for a moment, his gaze intense but not harsh. "I've heard you've been doing well, keeping a low profile, staying out of trouble," he said with a faint smile. "That's good to hear. I appreciate the effort you've put in to correct things." She nodded, relieved to hear him speak with such calmness. "I really appreciate the second chance you gave me. It meant a lot." He gave a small shrug, as though the apology and the incident were no longer his concern. "Mistakes happen. What's important is how we move forward. I believe you're doing that. Keep it up." Emily felt a rush of gratitude and a strange sense of pride in hearing those words. It wasn't just that Mr. Thompson had forgiven her. It was that he had acknowledged her effort to change. He could have easily dismissed her, treated her as just another employee who made a mistake, but instead, he had given her the space to prove herself again, and that meant more to her than anything. For a moment, they both stood there in silence, the hum of the airport terminal around them. Emily felt the tension she had carried for months begin to dissipate, like a weight finally being lifted from her shoulders. She had faced her mistake, owned up to it, and now she was truly free from it. "I won't forget this," she said, her voice more confident than she expected. "Thank you again for the opportunity to make things right." Mr. Thompson offered a genuine smile, the first one she had seen from him since that day on the plane. "Don't mention it. Just keep doing your job with the same level of respect and professionalism you've been showing. That's what matters." He turned back to the passengers, and Emily, feeling a strange sense of peace, walked away. The encounter, brief as it had been, marked the final step in her personal and professional journey to redemption. She had done more than just keep her job. She had earned back her self-respect. As she walked through the terminal, heading toward the crew lounge for her break, Emily couldn't help but reflect on how far she had come. There was no escaping the reality of the mistake she had made, but now it wasn't something that defined her. It was just part of her story, an experience that had shaped her, but not one that would hold her back. The future, she realized, was all about the next step. And as long as she kept moving forward, she knew she could face anything. The months that followed felt like a slow but steady transformation for Emily. The pressure she had once felt from the incident began to fade, replaced by a quiet confidence that came with consistency. The training sessions, the extra hours spent reflecting on her behavior, and the new mindset she had adopted were now ingrained in her daily routine. She wasn't just going through the motions anymore. She was learning, evolving, and most importantly, she was proud of how far she had come. Emily had noticed a shift not only in herself, but also in the way her colleagues treated her. There was no longer the lingering awkwardness, no more sideways glances or hesitant conversations. It was as if the event had faded into the past, buried beneath the weight of time and effort. Her teammates respected her more now, seeing her as someone who had learned from her mistakes and used them as stepping stones for growth. That recognition felt far more rewarding than any formal praise or acknowledgement from management. One evening, after a particularly long flight, Emily found herself sitting at the crew lounge, sipping coffee with a few of the flight attendants she worked with regularly. They were talking about the usual things, the flight, the passengers, and the next destinations. But this time, the conversation shifted, and Emily could feel the subtle shift in tone. "You know, Emily," one of her colleagues, Sarah, said with a grin, "I've been watching you lately. You're a lot more calm than you used to be, like a lot more." She chuckled, nudging the person next to her. The others laughed too, but Emily didn't mind. In fact, she found herself smiling in return, feeling the warmth of their camaraderie. It was an innocent comment, but it meant something deeper. It was a reminder of how much she had changed, how much she had worked to get to this point. The fact that her colleagues had noticed, that they saw a different side of her now, filled her with quiet pride. "I guess I've learned how to take a step back," Emily replied, her smile genuine. "Sometimes you just need to take a deep breath before reacting. It's something I had to figure out the hard way." Another flight attendant, Mark, nodded in agreement. "Yeah, I get that. We all do at some point, but the important thing is that you've kept your head on straight. You've been solid ever since." Emily took another sip of her coffee, considering his words. She had worked hard for that. She hadn't expected a round of applause or any special recognition, but knowing that her colleagues respected her again, that they saw the effort she had put into improving herself, meant more than anything. The conversation turned to lighter topics as the evening went on, and Emily found herself laughing along, her earlier thoughts drifting away. She realized that while the incident with Mr. Thompson had once consumed her, it was now just a part of her past. She wasn't running from it, but she wasn't living in it anymore either. It was an experience that had shaped her, yes, but it didn't define her. The next morning, Emily received another unexpected call from HR. Her heart skipped a beat as she saw the familiar number pop up on her phone. She had learned not to jump to conclusions, but the sound of it still sent a wave of anxiety through her. "Hi, Emily," Sarah said when Emily answered. "I just wanted to give you a heads up about something. We've been receiving some feedback lately, and I'm happy to say it's all been positive. Your performance has been excellent. I know we talked about your training a while ago, but I think you're well past that stage now." Emily's pulse quickened and she forced herself to stay calm. "Really?" she asked, her voice a little softer than usual. "That's great to hear." "Yes, really," Sarah replied, her tone light and friendly. "I think you've done a fantastic job of integrating the lessons we discussed. It hasn't gone unnoticed. So, I just wanted to take a moment to thank you for your hard work and dedication. You've really turned things around." Emily felt a rush of relief. All the efforts she had put in, the long hours of self-reflection and extra work, had paid off. It wasn't about a promotion or a bonus. It was about knowing that her growth had been recognized, that she was back to being the professional she had always wanted to be. "Thank you, Sarah. That really means a lot to me," Emily said, her voice steady but filled with gratitude. "I'm doing my best, and I really appreciate the support." "We appreciate you too, Emily. Keep up the good work," Sarah said before hanging up. As Emily set the phone down, a sense of calm washed over her. She had learned how to balance her job with the emotional side of it, how to stay grounded no matter what challenges came her way. It wasn't always easy, and there were days when the pressure still felt overwhelming, but she had become more resilient, more confident in her ability to handle whatever was thrown at her. Over the following weeks, Emily's sense of peace deepened. She continued to maintain her professional standards, always striving to be better, but she no longer carried the weight of past mistakes with her. She had confronted them, learned from them, and moved forward. That's what mattered now. One evening, after a particularly smooth flight, Emily found herself standing at the gate, waiting to deplane, when a young girl and her father passed by. The girl was struggling with her carry-on, the same way Emily had seen so many passengers do before. Instinctively, Emily stepped forward to offer help. "Can I give you a hand with that?" she asked, her voice soft and friendly. The father looked at her with a slight smile, clearly relieved. "That would be great, thanks," he said, handing over the bag. As Emily helped the girl lift her bag into the overhead compartment, she couldn't help but smile. The girl thanked her politely, and Emily returned to her seat with a sense of fulfillment. It was a small moment, but it was one that showed her just how far she had come. She didn't snap. She didn't get frustrated. She simply helped, offering a bit of kindness to make someone's experience a little easier. It was moments like this, the quiet ones that went unnoticed by most, that reminded Emily why she had chosen this career in the first place. She didn't need grand gestures or constant validation. All she needed was the knowledge that she was doing her job to the best of her ability, one moment at a time. And with that, she knew she had finally found her footing again. The past was behind her, but the future was bright. It was a sunny afternoon when Emily boarded her final flight of the week. She had finished her shift and was feeling that rare sense of accomplishment that only comes after a long day of hard work. The hum of the plane as it taxied down the runway felt familiar, comforting even, like a rhythm she had fallen into over the past several months. But today was different. Today, Emily had finally reached the point where she could say, without hesitation, that she had fully moved past the incident with Mr. Thompson. She had gone through a lot over the past few months. Long training sessions, difficult self-reflection, and the pressure of proving herself to both her colleagues and management. Yet, despite all the tension, the fear of being judged, and the weight of the mistake she had made, she had come out on the other side stronger. The lessons had been hard-earned, but they had shaped her into someone who knew how to handle herself. Someone who understood the importance of respect, patience, and professionalism in all aspects of her work. As the flight progressed, Emily found herself moving through the motions, assisting passengers with a quiet confidence that came from within. Her hands no longer shook when handing out beverages or offering assistance. Her smile was genuine, her tone steady and calm, and she felt a deep sense of satisfaction in knowing she was doing her best, every single moment. About halfway through the flight, as Emily passed through the aisles to check on passengers, she caught sight of a little girl sitting by the window, her hands clutching a stuffed bear. The girl was looking out at the clouds, her face full of wonder, and Emily couldn't help but be reminded of herself at that age. It wasn't lost on her how much had changed since the incident. She had walked through fire, so to speak, and had come out the other side with a deeper sense of empathy and humility. Emily approached the little girl's seat with a soft smile, taking a moment to ask if she was comfortable. "Are you okay?" she asked gently. The girl looked up, blinking as if snapping out of a daydream. "Yes. I'm just looking at the clouds," she said, her voice filled with awe. Emily chuckled. "They are beautiful, aren't they? Just wait until we're above them. The view is amazing." The little girl nodded, her eyes wide with excitement. Emily couldn't help but think how simple yet meaningful those moments were. It wasn't about handling the major crises or the complaints that could come her way. It was about these small interactions, the ones that went unnoticed by most people, that were the real heart of her job. It was these everyday moments of kindness and connection that made the work worth doing. As she continued down the aisle, helping passengers and offering assistance where needed, Emily reflected on the person she had become. She had grown into someone who understood that mistakes weren't the end of the world. They were just part of the process, a step on the path to becoming better. And while she would never forget the mistakes she made on that flight with Mr. Thompson, she also knew that it no longer defined her. The past was something she had accepted, learned from, and moved forward from. She wasn't running from it anymore. She had faced it head on, and it had only made her stronger. As the flight came to a close, Emily helped the last passengers off the plane, feeling that familiar sense of fulfillment wash over her. She didn't need a grand gesture or a big celebration to know that she had done well. The way the passengers thanked her, the smiles from her colleagues, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing she had done her best, those were the things that mattered most. When she finally made her way back to the crew lounge, there was a sense of peace in the air. The tension from the past had been replaced with a quiet confidence. She had done the work, she had put in the effort, and she had earned her place back, not just as a flight attendant, but as someone who had grown, learned, and come through a challenging time with integrity. Emily sat down in one of the chairs, her mind at ease. She could now look forward, knowing that whatever came next, she was ready. There was always room for growth, always a chance to be better, and she had no intention of stopping. The past might have shaped her, but it would never limit her. And as the day wound down and her colleagues gathered around to chat about the next shifts, Emily couldn't help but smile, knowing that the future was full of possibilities, one flight at a time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.